Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your hosts, Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Today we're interviewing Lisa Knutson, a musician and educator in the Philadelphia area who has done significant research into the work of the Jesuit missions in the New World. We have her on our show today to discuss the missionary role that music and art have played in both the Jesuit missions and in her own work as an educator today. Thanks so much for joining us today, Lisa.
Thanks for having me.
So you've done a lot of research about the role of music and musical instruments at the Jesuit missions, also known as the Reductions in South America. Could you explain to us how the Jesuits saw music as a vital tool in evangelization?
Sure. Well, as I've looked at the Jesuits in their first few years, you can see that in general, music was very important to them, even though they were doing many different things, working in many different sciences. But art and all of creation itself really very instrumental in St. Ignatius's way of thinking about the materials of the world, the creatures, the creation being used to glorify God. So right away in his spiritual exercises, he talks about all of the things of the world, even position, honor, but materials of the world can be ordered and used to glorify God, and by this means to save souls. And so right away, one of St. Ignatius's companions, Jerome Nadal, is instructed by St. Ignatius to have an illuminated gospel. And this work of art, or series of works of art, is eventually published and then taken to all of the mission lands. And art and music, and as I said, are all kind of seen as a tool, a useful thing for evangelization, for communication with these varied cultures and new lands that they were entering. As you are well aware, of course, the Jesuits were going all over the place right away. By the time St. Ignatius dies in 1556, he has established 33 colleges on 3 different continents. And of course, we're familiar with those early missionaries and how vast their traveling was. And so in working with these new people, of course, they couldn't communicate through language at first, and so art was used as a primary means. Music especially worked in the Reductions for communication. And so talking then specifically about the Reductions, which I think is just such a great example of how missionary music really works. They were established as fully functioning and self-sustaining communities linked together for the Guarani natives of present-day Paraguay, Bolivia, and expanding into Argentina and Brazil. At the height, there were about 30 of these missions, and each mission was kind of known for its craft, its particular work, as a means of sustainability. And so one mission would produce adobe tiles, or one would have workshops for woodworking, or some of them were known for musical instrument making. And agriculture throughout was also a large part of these communities. So the idea here is that the Jesuits were bringing an entire self-sustaining community for mind, body, soul, and really helping them to also sustain peace, keeping them away from other Europeans who were in some ways in contrast, like wanting to take over these native people for slave labor or for purposes of wealth on their own part. So the Reductions were quite different. And I think that's important to note because, the use of music here and what we see in the Reductions is not just music because the Jesuits wanted something shiny and fancy for themselves. It was really the care of the entire person, the dignity for the human person as a whole, and of course, trying to save the soul. So part of the success of the Reductions, it was in large part due to this remote location. So then specifically talking about the music, one notable Jesuit was Father Anton Sepp, a German. He himself was a very talented musician and instrument maker, and he taught the natives all kinds of musical instruments. So he exposed them to about every instrument he could get his hands onto. Of course, the pipe organ, he tried to establish pipe organs in every of the mission churches at that time, but also violins and bagpipes. I mean, just everything. So At one of the missions, they started making their own instruments. And then it would be that they would train the young Guarani boys and the adults in how to sing. And using compositions that were being written for them, they would employ this beautiful polyphonic music and the use of instruments at Mass. But additionally, they would also have secular music as well, some operas actually in their own language, which is very interesting. Some of the works that have survived today are by well-known composer Domenico Zipoli, and some masses and music for the divine office also is surviving. I guess, what strikes me most about this is the fact of its location. I just go back to this, how remote it was. And, it means something that they went to such great lengths to have beautiful music, beautiful churches themselves, carved tree trunks into pillars, beautifully carved statues and ornamentations of metal. Why did they go to such extent to do beautiful things, beautiful church and beautiful music in the jungle? For example, there are stories of the pipe organs. They would have to be crafted. Maybe the pipes were crafted in one area and then hauled through the mountainous regions on donkey back to get set up in whatever parish or whatever church it was. So this is something that just strikes me as an interesting thing when I look at the Jesuits, that clearly they saw music and beauty as more than just an add-on or an extra thing. There certainly was something they were finding that was essential.
That's really, really beautiful, Lisa. I like the way that you said that the Jesuits used art as a means to heighten the communication with people in missions throughout the world. The expression of the dignity, giving them the experience of living a full life with producing art and, having them really become full, reach high levels of, high art, of fine art, and teaching them to produce that. That's really great insight. Thank you.
Yeah. When you think of the Jesuits, one of the things that is highlighted most essentially, I think, is the use of materials, the use of the things of the earth. And the principle and foundation of the spiritual exercises say the man is first and foremost created to praise, reverence, and serve God our Lord, and by this means to save his soul. The other things on the face of the earth are created for man to help him in attaining the end for which he is created. Hence, man is to make use of them in as far as they help him in the attainment of his end, and he must rid himself of them in as far as they prove a hindrance. And so our one desire and choice should be what is more conducive to the end for which we are created. And one of the Jesuit motto is ad majorem Dei gloriam, all for the greater glory to God. And everything, whether it's a cup of tea that you're drinking, for a very silly example, but anything can be used to glorify God. And that's a very Ignatian principle. And so you definitely see that using the things, the materials, the instruments for the dignity, as you said, of the human person.
Yeah, it reminds me of the scripture, seek ye first the kingdom of God and everything else shall be given unto you. The Jesuit missions seem to be a very striking example of that in history, of how that's shown forth.
Yeah, certainly.
So it's also interesting that the idea of the dignity of the human person is highlighted and brought to a greater perfection through the worship of God in the sacred liturgy, because all of those arts can come together in the worship of God in the sacred liturgy. And so there's a harmonious vision for how the dignity of man is related to worship to God. And so many people in our time look at the beautiful buildings, paintings, and other works of art, especially those that are designed for use in the liturgy. And they criticize the church for extravagance, saying that the funds that were used to create these works of art could and should, in fact, be used instead to feed the poor, provide medical care, or for other corporal works of mercy. But the Jesuit reductions seem to show that the church sees no conflict of interest between artistic patronage and care for the poor. Could you talk a little bit about how the Jesuits understood the role of beauty, particularly in the lives of the poor?
Sure. So again, I think if we look at the principles of the Jesuits, they're really considering all mankind either being saved or working for the kingdom of Christ, or not, and working in the kingdom of Satan. And so every person is in a constant struggle between these two kingdoms. So therefore, every person is poor, in need of saving, I guess you could say, and that the salvation of the soul is at the first and foremost. But as you were saying, the dignity of the human person then is very much evident in the education that the Jesuits first provide in Europe, but also bringing this to all the other continents and, establishing the colleges and the universities and this humanist education, which does educate the entire person. That then translating, as you said, to the liturgy is so very evident in the mission lands. It's really stunning, of course, to me in the reductions, just how beautiful these missions were and the art that was being done. And again, with respect for the culture, it wasn't something that it was forced upon them. In fact, they were given sort of the tools to express their own culture in its fullest sense. And so one of the bishops from Argentina at the time, I don't know where, I can't remember exactly where he was from, but he was visiting the Reduction missions. And he wrote back and he said, to see these churches, the service of divine worship, the piety in prayers, the dexterity in singing, the tidiness and ornateness of the altars, the respect and magnificence with which the Blessed Sacrament is served, caused in me on the one hand an inexplicable tenderness, but on the other hand shameful confusion, noticing such a big difference between some pueblos that have just left pagan barbarity and the other ones, old Christians, who should go and learn from the former ones to venerate and to serve. And so, even though these new converts were, by European standards at that time, maybe not the highest culture, they understood how to worship God, and it was noticeable that it was sincere. And so I think that knowing this, the respect for the poor then, and serving and working with the poor, the human person at its essence is in need of God and is created in the image and likeness of God. And so this really doesn't make any two people any different. Like I said, we're either on the side of Christ or we're not. And this could be even within our own lifetimes. We're discerning spirits at all times, whether this is the best use of our talents or not. And so just going back, I guess, to the principles that I think help us to understand why the Jesuits are so beautiful in working with the poor, is this term magis, that they kind of credit to all things that they're doing. Magis is like a term that means the more or the greater. And the Jesuits have such a diversified and prolific output of research in almost every scientific field, and exploration, of course, as well. And so the idea here is that they're giving the best. They're looking for the best ways to serve. And so this is very important when you think about serving the poor, because the woman in the gospel who pours the ointment on the feet of Jesus, she doesn't just pour some oil that is, common. No. It's the best. It's the very most beautiful thing that she could possibly give. And so when you apply this to every principle of our life, well, then of course you see that in divine worship, all the more reason to pour at the feet of Jesus the very best that you can. And then also to serve the poor in that way too. The poor deserve beautiful music as well, beautiful statues. So I hope that answers a little bit what you were talking about.
Yeah, well, and I love the idea of not only the education for the poor, and teaching them how to appreciate art and, giving them an elevated experience of things that they might not otherwise be familiar with, but also the example of churches or public architecture. And even I think that the same would be true for, liturgical music, is that, when a person walks into their church, their local church, it's theirs. And so their experience of, incredible beauty is their experience, and they kind of own, in a sense, that they're able to touch something sacred, something beyond them, something beyond just what they might be capable of if their means and, they're poor. But when they experience something like that with art or beautiful statues, and especially if they're, educated, informed, and being able to create that themselves,
right,
then, that makes them really artistically rich.
It's
which is
also
really
beautiful for a poor person who might be living in, not very good conditions. Maybe they're even homeless, living on the street, maybe in squalor or something, that they can go into a place and experience something that's far more beautiful than the things they own or the places they sleep. I'm always touched when I see a homeless person sleeping in the back pew of a church, mm-hmm. that it's not just a warm place for them to sleep, but it's a beautiful place, and it's a place close to the Blessed Sacrament, that Christ right. is really present there. And that's a really beautiful thing. You don't have to pay for entrance to a church. Mm-hmm. You don't have to pay to see these beautiful things. You don't have to pay to hear these beautiful things. And like Peter said, they, in a sense, because you're entering into the house of God, they are there for you, and they become something that you own, even if the things that you actually own in your daily life are very little or right. not good.
And, furthering this as well, it's so true that any person can be inspired or come closer to God by walking into a space and being uplifted by beautiful architecture, beautiful art. And then in the same way, God can communicate with that person, telling the story through the images, through the senses, through the smells, the warmth, as you say, the beautiful music. And this is something that also is very Jesuit in its charism, is the idea of prayer involving the senses. And I don't want to go into some of maybe the more strange things we've seen in recent years, but St. Ignatius talks about all through the spiritual exercises of incorporating the senses into your meditation on the Gospels. So, for example, maybe to think about what it might have smelled like in hell, the terrible sulfur smell. Well, I know that I would have never dreamed of thinking about applying a sense of smell to a prayer. But when you're meditating upon something in the Gospel, I think it's something that St. Ignatius is encouraging us to get all of our senses involved so that we have, a deeper sense of the pain that the lost souls suffer, or that if it inspires us to change our lives. And so then when you think of the artwork existing there in a building, for example, if it's a painting of a gospel story, well, it's not there. It is there to worship God, but it is also there for our communication with God, for understanding how we can be placed in that setting and how we can then understand how we are in relationship to God on a very understandable sense. We can all see the art and understand a great deal.
So to change gears a little bit, Lisa, I wanted to ask something, I guess, a little bit more on your the side of your personal experience.
Sure.
You're a mother of 5, but it seems like you personally have maybe a bit of this Ignatian missionary spirit. You founded a community orchestra in a low-income neighborhood in Minnesota, and now you teach sacred music at a Catholic elementary school in a financially challenged area in Philly. Could you tell us a bit about the structures of the musical outreach programs you've run and that you're currently running?
Sure. Well, it's just such a kind of a turn of events because, I've set out as a sacred musician, working full-time as a director of music for a parish in Minnesota. And that parish actually was a Jesuit parish, but then was taken over by another religious order. And I was there during that transition. But it wasn't until some years later that I thought about the fact that our choir numbers were dwindling. The choir members were getting older. There were some real factors that I had to start searching in my head about, well, what can we do here in this neighborhood in Minnesota? And of course, just like a lot of more traditional architecture, older churches, the membership or the neighborhood around our parish included a lot of new immigrants, and it was becoming a lesser area financially than what it had been when the church was built. And so for all of these reasons, the one thing that struck me was the former Catholic school here that was right attached to our parish had a lot of space. And we could be utilizing this space for helping the kids right here in our neighborhood. For example, we had a charter school that was renting one of our buildings. And it struck me when, we had maybe 200 children right on our doorstep every single day, but yet they would never, ever come into the church. And so all of these things, with talking with the pastor, of course, led us to the idea of starting an after-school youth orchestra. And also we had the benefit of having a high school seminary there on campus as well. And so these boys came from all over the country and from different neighborhoods. They were predominantly Hispanic as well. And so we had kind of a very diverse group of kids, a lot of whom, or I should say none of whom, had ever had any musical experience. And so our job was then to teach them from the beginning about music, and we used instruments to do that. We applied for a grant for instruments so that the kids that could not afford an instrument or couldn't afford to rent one were provided one. And there were times when we had some families that took advantage of borrowing our own instruments, and this allowed for them then to just focus on learning the music. But we made sure at the beginning, and this is kind of what made us different from a secular program, is that we made sure at the beginning that they were given free violin lessons by professional instructors from our area who we hired to teach these children. And in exchange for free lessons, they would be required to play as an orchestra for Mass about once a semester. And in this way, then the church was also gaining something. We were gaining this youthful presence of young kids in the choir loft. And thanks be to God, our choir loft was huge. And so we could fit 45-piece orchestra up there.
Wow.
And it was really wonderful with the organ. And then every time we played for Mass, of course, the kids, the first thought, I'm sure, of many people is kids playing for Mass. That has to sound terrible. But we made sure we hired professional string players to carry the bulk of the Mass. So we would have singers and professional orchestra doing the ordinary of the Mass. And then the kids, perhaps I would write like a simple part for some of them to play with the Agnus Dei or something. But for the most part, they were playing things like the responsorial psalm, or during some of the hymns that we had, or I was setting maybe a piece, like occasionally the prelude or some other places that they could fit in. So the important thing there for me, at least, was for them to be able to hear really good players and to get that experience as well. So anyway, that was in Minnesota with the after school youth orchestra, and it was what I think pretty successful, and it still is running today very well. And then we moved here to Philadelphia, and I started working in a neighborhood that is kind of known as the Badlands, I guess, by law enforcement. It's a very difficult neighborhood. It's mostly Puerto Rican and immigrants from the Dominican Republic. And it has a history of gang activity and all of this. But there was something about this area and offering something to these kids who, that they can't otherwise, for whatever reason might be, they can't otherwise have musical education. And I think when we're thinking about, and I've certainly am still learning about working with the cultures that I am, why is it that I, for example, can take my kids to private violin lessons? And, I have kids that are in private lessons right now, a couple of my kids. But why is it that I can do that? Well, a few of these reasons are that my schedule allows for me to do that. So even if I'm working at a school or if I'm, at a parish or something, I can take time out of my day and drive my kids to their lesson and get home. Now, parents in some of these neighborhoods are not necessarily either able to do that, or that's just not even in their radar. For example, a lot of children, and I'm meaning children like third graders, take the public bus to school. And I would even be a little nervous taking the public transportation system in some of these neighborhoods, but this is how the kids get to school. And so then for them to consider going a half an hour away to a private lesson, it might just not be possible in terms of transportation. So there are several factors. It's not just a money situation. So anyway, this is kind of how we have established working with them.
So I'm wondering, in your work, what kind of effects you've seen of beauty in the lives of the poor? What are sorts of conversations you've had with children, with parents, families, or perhaps even with parishioners who notice what's going on in these programs?
Sure. Well, just a week ago or 2 weeks ago, one little girl in the school came to me and she was so excited. And she said, "Guess what, Mrs. Knutson? I am starting piano lessons." And I said, "Wow, that is really great." And of course, when I go to the classroom, this classroom is very meager setup. The public schools, it seems like they have really great facilities. And I won't say maybe every public school has a great facility, but more than these small Catholic schools. This is a small Catholic school. And I should mention that this is part of the independent mission schools of Philadelphia. And there are 15 of these schools run by the IHM sisters. They do a fantastic job of being in poor neighborhoods. That's where they want to be. That's the mission of what they do. And the sisters do a great job of providing really great education for these neighborhoods. But anyway, so when I'm in this classroom, really all I have is a keyboard and I have some other little instruments, and it's a lot of children packed into a kind of a smaller setting. And so anyway, some of them are just so fascinated with me playing the keyboard, for example. They've never maybe seen someone in person playing an instrument for them. And so anyway, this girl came to me and said, I am taking piano lessons. And so this is really a wonderful experience, because then you see that the kids are really engaged. They want to learn. Lots of little light bulbs have gone on through the course of my working with students. And we all have those moments, I'm sure, those of us that work with any child, where all of a sudden their interest is piqued. And that's such an exciting thing.
Yeah, I think that's, the happy teacher moment when the student, the light bulbs turn on and they make what you've been trying to teach them, they make it their own, and then they're excited about it and want to do their own things with it. So yeah, that's really beautiful.
Yeah. One thing, going back to the Jesuits, and this has kind of been a question in my mind, is how to connect what they did in their missions with what we're doing in our current society. And one thing that has stuck out is they would cross the town square ringing a bell, the Jesuits would. And the bell was a means to attract the children to come with them. And maybe there would be some sort of fun song or something, but the kids were interested in to see what was going to happen here. So maybe out of curiosity, they followed this Jesuit and to see what he would do. This was exciting. And they would come in, they would start singing the catechism, or they would start doing other things, learning about the faith. And that bell, what can that bell be here in our society? And for me, when I consider the different types of neighborhoods, the different types of students, the music lessons, by and large, most parents would really love music lessons for their kids, and to be able to play an instrument. And most kids really would love to do that as well, whether or not they have the opportunity. So I know also in Venezuela, for example, many successful stories of the El Sistema model working and changing lives completely there. So that's one thing that I'm just hoping to continue in the future, because there are many challenges working with the poor, because there are a lot of programs that they have. And sometimes I've found that what the definition of the poor is maybe not so much financially, but spiritually poor, of course, and culturally poor. But also there might be families out there that are just large families. So kids, 9 or 10 kids in a family. And some of the students that I've had have come from large Catholic families where there's no way that they could pay for 10 kids to take music lessons, but yet they're not getting any government assistance, and they're not on any other sort of programs. So there's an opportunity, I think, for every parish, no matter demographically where we are.
So you and your husband, Dr. Nathan Knutson, who's the director of music at St. Charles Borromeo Seminary in Philadelphia, run something called the Zipoli Institute, which is associated with the Argentinian religious order of the Institute of the Incarnate Word. Could you tell us about the Zipoli Institute and who Domenico Zipoli was? You mentioned him earlier as well.
Yes, the Zipoli Institute, Domenico Zipoli Institute, is an apostolate for sacred music of the Institute of the Incarnate Word. And it was started maybe 20 years ago by IVE priests, Instituto del Verbo Encarnado, priests in Argentina, and as a way to carry on the heritage of the missionary spirit of Zipoli. He was an organist in Rome at the Church of the Jesuits, and he was attracted to become a Jesuit brother. And so then he kind of left what was considered to be a very successful career as an organist in Rome and signed up to become a missionary and go to South America. And he was in Cordoba studying to become a priest, and unfortunately he passed away before he was ordained. But nonetheless, he was a Jesuit brother. He's a very prolific composer, wrote lots of music for the missions while in Argentina, and sent them to the reductions. And these works survive and were kind of rediscovered later on. So this desire of his to kind of leave everything in pursuit of offering beautiful music for the missions is kind of what our institute seeks to follow. So the things that we do, and Nathan and I kind of run the website component, because the IVE is an international order, and they go to the missionary lands or the missions where maybe they're very spread out throughout the whole institute. And some of them, no one else wants to be there, and they're in very poor locations in Guyana and some other places that are just without a lot of resources. So one idea here is to bring together some resources for sacred music that they can simply get without paying for them. So it's a very practical endeavor for them. But additionally, they have a desire, being a Hispanic order predominantly in their founding, to also spread the beauty of missionary music, the Spanish missionaries of the 18th century, 19th century. So part of it is to promote the works of the missionary composers as well. And so we do put on some events. We've done some things about California missionary music in recent years. And so education is part of our outreach and events. And also now we're compiling more and more resources for the Mass, especially the Spanish Mass.
Could you tell us what the website of the Zipoli Institute is?
Sure. It's DomenicoZipoli.org, DomenicoZipoli.org.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Lisa. This has been a great interview and really interesting to hear about not only the Jesuit missions, but how you've embodied that spirit in your own work and how you're seeking to accomplish beautiful things for the greater glory of God, according to your means and this Jesuit missionary spirit in the modern time.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. And of course, we're all in this together, and we do whatever little thing we can.
That's right. Well, thanks so much, Lisa.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Well, that's it for today. If you're interested in some of the resources we discussed in this episode, check out our website, sacredmusicpodcast.com, where we'll have more information and links to Spanish language resources. Join us next time for an interview with Kevin Allen, an acclaimed Catholic composer who has written a large body of sacred music for the Church.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, SoundCloud, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory's Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole, from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is the first movement of Trio Sonata No. 6 in G major by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Peter Carter. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.